thought I'd do something this format. Thought I might release a video at the end of the format, kind of giving my opinion of the format and sort of where I think the meta is, or what I think the best decks are, and how I think that the game would go down if the format was a competitive format, if we had like real events on and stuff like that. I want to I've wanted to do this before, and I kind of want to do it for formats that I have had enough experience in. Although some formats I like, especially since COVID, I haven't played as much because I can only play online. There's no events to play for, all that kind of stuff. But I have played quite a bit of Opus XIV, and I do have some fairly strong opinions. So firstly, I think that the best deck is very clearly Sophie Doga. It's basically the only real way to beat it is to kind of play like mass removal board clears, as in like Susano and Shantoto kind of thing, and just basically brute force your way through every copy of Sophie. Because without the RFG, there's too many ways to revive her. It's too easy to just keep putting that on the field. I want to make very clear also that Sophie is what makes this deck competitive. Doga just happens to be exactly her dual color. This is the first mass summons deck to be top tier. It's easy to sort of mistakenly credit that to Doga and Machery, but it's actually because Sophie sort of perfectly covers the inherent weaknesses of those summon heavy decks. I actually mentioned that in my I mentioned those weaknesses in my Opus 14 video. It was either Opus 14 or Opus 13, I can't remember. I think it might have been Opus 13 actually. Where, the problem with summon heavy decks is that you've got so many summons in your deck, you actually don't... You need bodies to actually kill your opponent, and often summon heavy decks not only had a lack of bodies because they were full of summons, but also those bodies weren't very aggressive. They didn't have haste and stuff like that. But Sophie covers all of that because she gives you a forward that you can just constantly play on the field. She effectively has haste in terms of the fact that she deals damage, and that sort of presence is all you really need, and then you can just fill your deck with other stuff. And Sildre is another big thing as well, that the fact that water happens to be the correct element for this, because it has Sildre, which can give you those forwards, and one of those forwards is the best forward, and all you have to do is put that on the field over and over again. So Sildre, you can always get to that. Really, what Mastery would be good in a world without Sophie, for the record. I'm not saying that at all, but I do think that a Doga deck would not be competitive without Sophie. What makes Sophie so oppressive, though, is that she basically does everything you need in Final Fantasy. So there are basically only two resources in the game, CP and damage. Effectively, there's really only one resource, which is CP, but then, of course, damage is actually how you win. So that's a way to surpass CP. But she just provides both of them without combat interaction. This is the first time in the game, besides Loop, but this is the only real way that you can kill someone without actually going to combat. Obviously, you probably will go to combat at some point, but the fact that you can threaten that without it, it takes a huge part of the game away. Even though combat is much less relevant these days compared to what it used to be, it's still part of the game. And the fact that to deal damage in the past, you've had to, you have to at least go through attack step, block step. There's so many points during that for players to inherently interact, and so if it takes all that away. She'd probably be okay if it was if she was harder to turn on, but the fact that she gets the double buff from the Water Earth forwards means that you only really need 3 bodies instead of 4, which is actually a huge difference. In fact, it's almost like only 2 bodies instead of 3, because, half the bodies revive her. Well, I say half. Lena gets out, Sarah, Sophie, and Ursula, if you play Ursula, she does the same thing. So it's way too easy to turn her on, and that's the big issue. But that's enough about Sophie. Next up, we obviously have Aggro Decks. So Stern Leonis has enabled a bunch of new Aggro Decks. So for the record, the Vice King part, interestingly, funnily, you would think that this is something I would have played a lot of, but I actually have very little experience with Vice King in this format with Stern Leonis, so I can't say a lot about that. We started out with a lot of Estelle, and Estelle was sort of the first Stern Aggro deck that sort of reared its head and kind of, started to threaten people, and that's fair enough. But then, obviously, much later on, we got the Chocobos, and this kind of came out of nowhere, and I'm impressed. Like, honestly, I didn't give much credit to Chocobos. I don't really think about it. When someone mentioned there was a Chocobo deck during the Villain Tournament, I was like, oh, that's kind of cute, cool, it's like catch people by surprise or whatever. And then when I looked at it closer and then sort of played against it, I realized, oh, hang on a second, no, this actually is really threatening. Stern actually adds a huge amount to that deck. Stern and Bismarck together. But to the point that I actually think that Chocobos is pretty much the better version of Estelle. Nothing against Estelle, but I actually think Chocobos just do the same thing way better. And that's mainly because they are more resilient to board clears, they have better interaction because they also have Bismarck on top of Stern Leonis, and they're also better at cheesing damage with haste, which is actually pretty relevant, especially against board clears. The thing about Stern, right? So obviously making forwards cheaper and also providing zero cost instant speed interaction from your break zone is really strong. But there's a little bit deeper than that. What's really interesting is that he switches odds and evens. So odds and evens is like an interesting part of this game. It sort of comes with two main consequences. One of them is that if you have an odd number of backups, then to be efficient, you have to play at least one odd card. But more importantly, you can't play more odd cost cards efficiently than you have backups. That's basically that, and that's sort of like been a hidden rule that's sort of existed in the game since the game started, and that actually affects card balance quite a bit. There are a lot of odd cost cards that actually have a different place in the game because not just because of their cost specifically, but because the fact that specifically it's odd means that you can't play multiple in the same turn early, and you can't play them without backups. Stern takes that away, and so the clearest example is Stale. So there are these cards that are really, really potent aggressive cards, aggro cards, that have sort of been limited and sort of, held back or sort of gated by their odd cost. And so Stern flips it. Now suddenly cards like Stale and a bunch of the forwards of Stale, like Laswell, Ignacio, Sephiroths, all those, now suddenly you can play multiple of those in the same turn. You can play multiple without backups as well. And Chocobos is the other big example, because so many of them cost 3. Especially stuff like Chocobo Knight and the Chocobo that plays Chocobos from your hand when you play it. So the fact that before with a Chocobo Knight, to play a Chocobo Knight and then to play the Chocobo you search with it, assuming you already have Fat Chocobo, you'd need multiple backups to be able to do that efficiently. But now with Stern, you can just play all of them. And that's, it just changes that so much. It really changes that dynamic. And that's actually had a huge impact on, those two decks, clearest examples. I'm sure there are others. Stern also does a really good job of covering one of the big weaknesses of aggro, similar to how Sophie covers weaknesses of summons. Stern covers the weakness of aggro where it can't really interact with its opponent a lot of the time. So normally aggro decks struggle with interaction because they either don't have it at all, or if they want to play it, it costs extra CP and they can't really they can't afford to spend CP on the interaction as well as enough aggression to win the game. So Stern provides that. It provides both the CP and also the zero cost interaction that aggro kind of misses. So that's that's the big thing. One of the big things about him. It's a very polarizing card. That's enough about aggro though. Wind. So wind. For the record, when I talk about wind, I don't mean not just wanting wind. I talk about wind with anything. Basically, the wind engine is so strong and so self-contained and so powerful that you can basically play anything alongside it, and that will beat most in a polite game. Sorry, so not aggro, not DJ. In a polite game, that will beat basically any other deck that's not wind as well. So you can play mono wind, water wind, ice wind, fire wind, earth wind. You could probably even play lightning wind, although I don't see why you'll do that. I can't really see any benefit to that. I would say that I think Icewind is probably the strongest overall. However, I think Firewind is better against other wind decks, which means that if wind was if the aggro wasn't the meta and wind was prominent, then I think Firewind would actually be the best play. That's a side note though. It may not really be noticeable at the moment because aggro is so prevalent and wind doesn't have good tools to deal with that. But that if aggro gets nerfed, I promise you that wind will dominate the sort of the polite game, get the space of the game. What we've sort of considered a Final Fantasy game up to this point. The idea of play some backups, play some forwards, kind of fight for the board a bit, poke some damage here or there, and later on, try and finish them off, that kind of thing. That sort of game, wind just destroys any non-wind deck in that game, and that's mainly because of Bismarck, Typhon, Althea. So Bismarck, Typhon together, just by itself, that is quite strong. But the fact that you have Althea backing the Bismarck, which basically makes it impossible for your opponent to interact with him, that's insane and really oppressive. And so it makes it almost, once you have that, have a few backups and you have that sort of setup, it's almost impossible for your opponent to do anything. And then on top of that, you've got all these other great options as well, like Ochu and Zidane. Rosa she exceeded my expectations. She is a very solid threat, a good forward to just put on the field at any point in your wind deck, and now suddenly you have, you can do extra things if your opponent doesn't deal with it, which is decently hard to deal with thanks to her effect, especially in a world where Stern is so popular. So she creates some nice clean lines, and occasionally she high rolls hard, as long as you don't really try to make it happen. If you go too deep trying to make your Rosa happen, then you can actually, throw away your resources, and you don't want to do that. You just want to get it. If it comes up, then sure, grab it, and sometimes that can be really good. So one other thing to mention as well, this sort of overtaking Sophie as the best inevitability. So I talk about inevitability. I talk about, in a game that sort of gets into like a state where we're trading resources, trading CP or whatever, the deck with the highest inevitability is the one that's going to win that setup. And so last set that was Sophie, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. But now Wind has enough that it actually overtook Sophie in that respect, and that pushed Sophie into the Doga area, into the Doga version, which is the aggro version, which is funny because, that is actually turns out better in the end anyway, especially because of aggro being so prevalent means that the aggro deck with a bunch of EXs is going to be a really good choice. Yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. And then, of course, there's Loop. So this one, obviously close to my heart. This is actually the only non-aggro deck which destroys Wind, even. Saying that is a bit tongue-in-cheek, because it is also a Wind deck itself, although it doesn't obviously focus on and rely on the Wind engine. But, this will beat any other Polite deck in the game. It's basically only aggro that will threaten Loop most of the time. Typhon was basically the best buff that the Loop could receive. It's unconditional spot removal, which is repeatable thanks to Althea and also Bismarck, depending how you can play 1, you can play 3, whatever. And it can also block things, so that was a huge buff. But then, of course, aggro. So now that aggro is really popular, that pushes Loop out of it. Obviously, Sophie Doga was always an interesting one. When they play Hecaton Share, that's a huge issue for Loop. So Sophie Doga decks that play the 3-cost Hecaton Share, they are very threatening and will usually beat Loop most of the time, I assume. I've played against a few of them. And yeah, I think played correctly, they will threaten it a lot. Without Hecaton, it's different. It's a bit interesting. I don't know for sure where that matchup stands. It does seem to be like either way kind of thing. Sophie can put enough pressure on early to obviously kill the deck before it can loop them, but also Shantoto in that case is actually often enough, because Loop is one of the few decks that Sophie Doga can't rely on the fact that it will, just keep being able to put Sophie on the field and eventually will just win that way, because Loop will loop first before the Doga deck does enough damage just with Sophie, so they really need to, play the aggression and play the bodies and go for the attacks. And Typhon actually helps quite a bit against that, because it also not only pushes the Sophie away, it also doesn't put it in the break zone, so they can't revive it if that's the only copy they have. As for other aggro though, when it was just for Stale, it was fine, because in most games that you saw Shantoto, that wasn't an issue, because Shantoto buys you enough time to basically then, loop them out after that. But Chocobos are much more threatening for the reasons I listed above, especially the haste thing. That's huge, but also they can just generate bodies so much faster and so many more, and still keep regenerating them, that it's actually, that's a much bigger threat. And so I do think, I haven't played a huge amount of games because, Chocobos came near-ish the end of the format, but I have a strong feeling that Chocobos will win much more often than not against Loop. That's those are basically all the decks that I consider just like top tier. And then we go to other decks around that are, playable, that can win some games, stuff like that. That's all good. So as I mentioned before, Fire Earth, just because it has access to 2 removal board clears, is actually one of the few decks, maybe the only deck, that has a decent matchup against Sophie. That can actually, basically, to clear its board enough times, it will actually run out of ways to put Sophie on the field and make her trigger. Then you've got stuff like Fire Water EX decks, and so obviously that's become popular due to aggro being so popular. Now EX heavy decks become a lot more beneficial, so Fire Water is an easy sort of avenue for that. It's a good avenue. Mono Fire keeps getting good cards, so they keep releasing good cards for it, so it's good, it's fine, that's all good, and it's better against aggro than Wind. However, as I mentioned, Mono Fire actually plays a polite game, and so if it comes up against a Wind deck or Loop, it's just going to lose. And then Avalanche obviously has not had enough time. So now that it actually has the starter cards, so I'm not talking about just Tifa and Barrett without the starter, I'm talking about with the starter as well. It's promising. I obviously came late enough. I haven't enough time to determine exactly how good it is overall. Seems cool though. Seems pretty decent. There's stuff like Monks as well. So I actually have had the opinion since quite early in the format that Monks was sort of a not great compared to the other choices. Still just like fine. It's like kind of like Mono Fire. It's like it's fine. It's good. You'll beat a bunch of stuff, whatever. But against the actual good decks, I don't think it's a good choice. And especially obviously because Doga Sophie is just a better version of Sophie than Monks. It's just much better in the game at the moment. That's my thoughts. That's how I feel about it. as for where to go from here, I mean, so Opus 15 is obviously coming soon. I don't know. At the moment, I don't know how much impact it'll have. Obviously, we can never know until we see the entire set. Like something like Typhon, we didn't know about until the set came out. So, you know, there will always be cards that aren't spoiled until literally the moment that comes out that completely change our opinion on certain elements, certain decks, all that kind of stuff. That being said, though, I think, you know, Sophie has proven herself since she came out. You know, she has been top tier in multiple different forms. You know, she's played Polite, she's played Aggro. I think that sort of proves that she's not going to disappear. I think the only way to deal with something like that in the game is to, you know, this is where I think we might need a ban list. Like, I think we need more bans. I know that, you know, it's easy to always say, oh, that's how we fix a game, just ban some cards or whatever. I mean, I am actually a really strong advocate for ban lists. I mean, maybe it's because I come from Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't know if I'm biased, but I do find bans, I think the attitude that Square Enix have towards bans being like, oh no, like last resort, oh we don't want to do that, oh no. Like, I think that's the opposite attitude. I actually think that's not only detrimental, I think it's, you know, literal the opposite of what we need. I think we actually need them to think, okay, how can we make the game more interesting, more fun, more variety, that kind of stuff. And obviously that's hard to do, but I think they need to put more effort in. Because I don't see how something like Sophie would get dethroned unless something even more absurd came out. You know, and there's also always the idea of releasing specific counter to things, and I don't like that either, because when you release something specific counter to something that's good, you know, sure, while that good thing still exists in the counter, you know, you play it and you'll beat that thing, and then maybe that will push the good thing away, but now you've got this deck with this card, or either this deck or this card or whatever that's not good anymore because the thing that it was made to beat is not around, and so I think, oh, you know, now to beat other people, I'm going to take that out. You know, I'm going to play something else, and then the good deck comes back up again, and you get this rock paper scissors scenario where you basically are just gambling on matchups, pretty much. So I don't like that dynamic either. As for the aggro thing, that's obviously another hard problem to deal with. The obvious thing, you can say ban Stern. I mean, that would deal with a lot. That's fair enough. The annoying thing is, I think like aggro is fine to exist. It's just not fine if that's all that exists, basically. And, you know, when the games get so short that it's no longer enjoyable, you don't get enough time to really play your cards, you don't really get enough time to find some footing in the game and actually have some kind of meaningful interaction. That's when people start to get bored and annoyed and frustrated. And I think we really need to, you know, find some way to alleviate that. And sorry, not us, I mean Square Enix need to find some way to alleviate that with, you know, the rules, the card design, ban list, whatever. I just think they need to put more effort in. I don't know if they care enough. I don't know if that's something they're interested in. But, you know, it is getting to the point now where this game is getting much... I've said this to a lot of people. It's getting much closer to the other card games. We've sort of had this luxury that Final Fantasy has always been, you know, much more interactive, much more engaging, you know, a lot more going on. You get a lot more chance to play your cards, play different decks and all that kind of stuff. We've actually been really spoiled with FF allowing us to do that a lot in the past. Just these past few sets, especially the ones since COVID, I think that's just coincidence. I don't think that's because of COVID. I think it just happened that way. These sets have started to release certain cards and engines and you know, decks that are starting to take that away, and we're starting to get, you know, into the sort of getting a bit stale and sort of, you know, uninteractive. Games are decided a lot by opening hands, and, you know, the decks options are much less. We've got much less options of which decks to play. You know, much less innovation and that kind of stuff. And so I think, you know, that, I don't know if Square Enix have identified that. I don't know if they intend to deal with that. That's just how I feel. So thanks for watching as usual. Cheers.